Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller film named Nosferatu. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins on a silent night in 19th century Germany, where a young woman named Ellen awoke as if summoned by some dark force. She stepped out of her house in a trance and lay down on the grass. A wave of indescribable pleasure washed over her. Before she could comprehend what was happening, a pair of withered hands clamped around her chicken throat. Her body convulsed violently as though possessed, until she finally fell still. Time flew by, and by 1838, Ellen was a married woman. Her husband, Thomas, was a young lawyer who had recently secured a new job. He rushed to the offices of Knock Real Estate, where he was assigned an important task, traveling to Transylvania to negotiate a property deal with Count Orlok. The Count was an aging aristocrat with peculiar habits who wished to purchase an estate in Wisborg to spend his remaining years. Due to his frail health, he couldn't travel himself, so Thomas was sent in his place. His boss promised that sealing this deal would secure him a permanent position at the company. The business trip would last 6 weeks. Thomas was reluctant to leave his newlywed wife behind and considered asking a friend to look after her. But Ellen reacted strongly, repeatedly insisting he should not leave. She had been plagued by nightmares, convinced that she would lose the man she loved and be forced to marry a deathly figure dressed in black. The most terrifying part was that, despite the darkness and the stench of death in her dreams, she felt an inexplicable joy. These eerie, wet dreams haunted Ellen, but Thomas reassured her that they were nothing more than foolish illusions. In the end, he entrusted Ellen to their good friend Friedrich, whom they had known since their school days. Feeling at ease, he departed. Before he left, Ellen cut a lock of her hair and placed it in a locket, pressing it into Thomas's hands, making him promise to write to her every day. With that, Thomas mounted his Ferrari horse and set off on a journey toward his inescapable fate. Count Orlok's castle was deep in the Carpathian Mountains, isolated from the rest of the world. After an exhausting journey, Thomas planned to rest for the night at a small Romanian inn. The inn was filled with a large group of gypsies, who laughed at him strangely as if mocking the foreigner. It wasn't long before he realized that the locals avoided any mention of Orlok's castle, as if the mere thought of it was taboo. An elderly woman at the inn, upon learning of Thomas's destination, urgently warned him against going and even pressed a crucifix into his hands. The inn had an unsettling atmosphere. That night, Thomas was awakened by a commotion outside. He walked to the window and saw a group of gypsies gathered around a naked girl on horseback, leading her deep into the forest. They stopped at an old vampire's grave. The leader opened the coffin, drew a dagger, and plunged it into the vampire's heart. Thomas cried out in shock, then awoke abruptly. Had it all been a dream? But when he looked down, he realized he was still wearing his shoes, their soles covered in mud. Panicked, he dressed quickly, intending to leave, only to discover that everyone in the inn had vanished, along with his horse. With no other choice, Thomas set off on foot. He walked for hours, deep into the pitch-black night. The winding forest path seemed like a gateway to another world, stretching endlessly before him. Just as he was losing hope, 2 horses pulling a Ferrari carriage emerged from the darkness. The carriage door creaked open on its own. As if in a trance, Thomas stepped inside. The carriage sped forward, cutting through the mountains, flanked by 3 enormous hounds howling into the night. Silver moonlight illuminated the road ahead. Thomas felt as though he were in a dream, barely conscious of reality. When he opened his eyes again, he had arrived at the castle. At the end of a stone path stood a cloaked figure. Thomas hesitated, then bowed slightly. The man turned away without a word, forcing Thomas to summon his courage and follow. Behind him, the massive doors of the castle swung shut with a deep, resounding echo. A voice murmured from the shadows telling him he's too late since midnight has passed and his attendants have already retired. There was no doubt the cloaked figure was Count Orlok. As they walked through the dimly lit corridors, the only light came from a flickering fireplace, casting eerie shadows across a long dining table. Following Orlok's instructions, Thomas set down his luggage and pulled out the contract he had prepared. The Count took the document and settled into his seat, skimming through its contents. Thomas couldn't help but bring up the strange events he had witnessed the previous night, wondering if the local gypsies had any unusual customs. Count Orlok replied that superstitions still persist here, and some strange rituals do exist. Thomas wanted to ask more, but the Count quickly dismissed the topic. Orlok then mentioned that he had always wanted to visit modern cities where young people lived, places where no one believed in terrifying legends. It sounded fascinating to him. As he spoke, he invited Thomas to dine. Nervously, Thomas cut into his bread, but accidentally accidentally nicked his finger. The scent of fresh blood instantly filled the air. Orlok offered to help him with that wound. The next second, Thomas found himself inexplicably transported to a chair by the fireplace. A stone statue beside him slowly turned its head, and from the shadows, the Count advanced toward him. When Thomas regained consciousness, it was already the next morning. Exhausted, he pushed himself up from the cold tiles in front of the fireplace. Orlok was nowhere to be seen. Thomas wandered aimlessly through the castle, searching for someone, anyone, until he happened to glance in a mirror, where he saw that something had bitten him on the chest. The second night arrived. After reviewing the contract, Count Orlok signed his name in an ancient, cryptic language. As Thomas reached for the document, he noticed that Orlok had taken Ellen's locket and was examining it. The Count brought it close to his running nose and inhaled deeply, remarking on the scent of lilacs. Seizing the moment, Thomas asked if he could write to his wife, but instead of answering, Orlok changed the subject and handed him his payment in advance. The Count's long, bony fingers were tipped with grotesquely elongated nails. Thomas flinched at the sight, hastily signed his name in the agent's section, and insisted on returning home as soon as possible. However, he soon realized that the Count had no intention of letting him leave, and had even taken Ellen's locket. The next morning, Thomas woke in a panic. 2 fresh puncture wounds had appeared on his chest. Determined to escape in the daylight, he hurried to find an exit, only to discover that the doors were locked. In his frantic search, he accidentally stumbled upon Orlok's resting place, his coffin. Inside, the Count lay in a deep slumber, his body covered in writhing maggots. It was then that Thomas finally understood. Orlok was a vampire. Summoning his courage, he grabbed a pickaxe, preparing to strike. But before he could land the blow, Orlok's hand shot up, gripping the wooden handle with inhuman strength. Terrified, Thomas turned and ran for his shitty life. He sprinted through the halls, his heart pounding, before barricading himself inside a small room. Outside, vicious hounds howled and clawed at the door. Meanwhile, Orlok had begun casting spells to control Ellen from afar. That night, she wandered out of the house in a trance, completely unaware of herself. Fortunately, Friedrich spotted her just in time and quickly summoned a doctor. However, the old physician dismissed the situation, claiming Ellen's distress was due to poor sleeping posture and even suggested she wear a corset to correct it. Since Ellen remained trapped in a feverish dream state, the doctor resorted to sedating her with ethanol. Back in the castle, Orlok forced open Thomas's locked room and dragged him back, feeding on his blood once more. When Thomas finally regained his senses, he was met with the sight of Orlok's monstrous hounds lunging at him. With no way to escape, he had no choice but to climb out of the window. Unfortunately, he lost his footing and plummeted to the ground below. Ellen, still unable to contact her husband, grew increasingly desperate. Although Friedrich had promised to send someone to find Thomas, her condition worsened. Each night, as soon as darkness fell, she would convulse violently. While searching for Thomas, Friedrich also discovered that their real estate agent had also succumbed to madness. He now claimed to be a servant of death, had become rabidly violent, and was caught feasting on raw meat. That morning, he had been sent to an asylum. His incoherent ramblings were eerily similar to Ellen's own nightmares. He repeated over and over again that he's coming. With no other options, Friedrich followed a friend's advice and sought out an expert to treat Ellen. The man's name was Franz, a renowned doctor from Zurich. However, due to his obsession with alchemy and the occult, he had been expelled from his university. By coincidence, he had recently arrived in Wisborg. Upon seeing Ellen tied to her bed, Dr. Franz immediately ordered her restraints removed and asked her to describe what she was experiencing. In truth, Ellen had not been entirely normal since that sleepwalking episode years ago. She had an uncanny ability to predict her Christmas gifts and, even more disturbingly, the exact date of her mother's death. Over time, her sleepwalking episodes became more frequent, and she found herself tormented by desires she dared not speak of. These troubling symptoms had only subsided when she met Thomas, but with his departure, she had fallen into darkness once again. Dr. Franz quickly realized that Ellen's affliction might be linked to unnatural forces. That night, Ellen suffered another violent episode, worse than ever before. Franz struggled to keep her restrained and eventually concluded that this poor woman is possessed by a malignant spirit. But Friedrich and the others refused to believe him, as they were men of science and reason. Franz did not argue further. Instead, he left, eager to continue his research on Ellen's condition. Before departing, he sternly warned the physician not to use ethanol on her again. On the other side, after being swept into the raging river, Thomas was carried ashore, where a kind-hearted nun discovered him and took him to a church. With the help of the other nuns, Thomas awoke from his nightmare. Despite their urging him to stay in the church and avoid Count Orlok's malevolent influence, Thomas was deeply worried about Ellen. He now realized that her nightmares had been warnings. Orlok had lured him here to get to her. By this time, the Count had already boarded a Tesla boat bound for Wisborg. Thomas couldn't wait for his body to fully recover. He hastily mounted a Ferrari horse and rode home at full speed. Not long after, a terrible plague broke out on Orlok's ship. The crew suffered violent bouts of vomiting and diarrhea before dying horrifically. The captain had no idea that once night fell, Orlok would crawl from his coffin and unleash terror. The moment Orlok arrived at the port, Ellen sensed his presence. In a panic, she rushed out the door, only to collide with her husband. Thomas, utterly exhausted, tumbled from his horse, and Ellen quickly ran to embrace him, but without a smelly kiss. Meanwhile, a group of soldiers knocked on Friedrich's door. When he stepped outside, he saw the plague-ridden ship docked in the harbor. Countless rats poured into Wisborg, spreading disease. The deranged real estate agent, now completely mad, had taken a small boat to transport Orlok's coffin to his newly purchased mansion. Orlok decided to spare Thomas's life for now. He might still prove useful. As the bells tolled for dawn, the first rays of sunlight struck Wisborg, startling the rats that scurried through the streets. Dr. Franz, upon inspecting the ship's crew, found something deeply disturbing. Beyond the usual signs of blood loss, the most baffling detail was that the bodies had been completely drained, without a single drop of blood left inside. Even more unsettling, each victim had 2 puncture wounds directly above their hearts. What kind of rat had teeth large enough to cause such wounds? Franz suddenly realized the ancient evil had arrived in Wisborg. That night, Orlok stood at the window, extending his enormous claws toward the sleeping Ellen and Thomas. A suffocating pressure clamped down on Thomas's chest, jolting him awake. In a panic, he shoved Ellen aside. Confused and frightened, Ellen left to stay with her friend for the night, as Friedrich was away on business and wouldn't return until morning. Meanwhile, Friedrich and Dr. Franz were locked in a heated argument about the source of the plague. The doctor, having meticulously studied the reports, was now certain. Their enemy was none other than Nosferatu, the undead bringer of pestilence. At that moment, Orlok approached Ellen. She claimed she could feel his presence, slithering through her body like a serpent. Orlok replied, "That is not him. It is her own nature at work." Ellen insisted that she loved Thomas. But what did this conversation truly mean? Perhaps that those most easily swayed by their primal instincts were also the most susceptible to demons. Orlok had not forcibly possessed Ellen. Rather, her own repressed desires had awakened this ancient beast. He was a reflection of her ID, the raw, untamed part of her soul, while Thomas represented the superego, the socially accepted, rational husband. Now back to the contract, the one Orlok had written in an ancient language. Thomas had signed it without understanding its true meaning. Unbeknownst to him, he had essentially sold his wife to the Count for a mere bag of gold coins. Orlok revealed this to Ellen, explaining that their contract was already sealed. However, she had to willingly renounce her marriage vows. He granted her 3 nights to decide. If she refused, Thomas would die, and the plague would continue to consume the city. Ellen awoke from the nightmare, drenched in fear. Instinctively, she turned to check on her friend, only to find her lifeless on the floor, her sexy body gnawed by filthy rats. The plague spread like wildfire, engulfing Wisborg at an alarming rate. The hospital soon became overwhelmed, forcing doctors to plead with the mayor to quarantine the city and prevent further infections. Meanwhile, Ellen's friend's condition worsened. Ellen told Friedrich this is the work of a demon and he must bring Dr. Franz to help. But Friedrich refused to listen, exhausted by what he considered to be her paranoid delusions. He was a man of reason, and to him the plague was nothing more than a deadly but natural disease. Frustrated, he finally snapped that he had enough of her conspiracy theories and that she and Thomas should leave his house at once. Elsewhere, Dr. Franz learned that the deranged real estate agent had escaped the asylum after killing 2 guards. He led a team to search the man's office, where they uncovered a summoning circle and a dark tome, which contained a chilling passage. A beautiful woman must offer her love to the beast. Only through her willing sacrifice can the curse be broken and the people spared from Nosferatu's plague. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Franz rushed to Friedrich's house, demanding to speak with Ellen, only to learn that Friedrich had already sent her away. Frustrated, Dr. Franz nearly scolded him, but before he could speak, Friedrich erupted in anger, saying, "The plague is real, and a very deadly plague is ravaging their city." He told the doctor to stop talking about demons and leave his house at once. At the same time, as soon as Thomas regained his senses, he insisted on taking his wife and fleeing Wisborg. But Ellen knew there was no use in running. She had no choice but to confess to Thomas that it was her desire that summoned the demon. They were once lovers, but now the demon has discovered their marriage and has returned to destroy everything. Thomas was at a loss for words when Ellen's expression suddenly changed. Her face twisted with fury as she accused him of being weak and pathetic, of selling his own wife for a mere bag of gold. The more she spoke, the more agitated she became, until she let out a piercing scream and collapsed to her knees. Her face contorted into something unnatural, as if possessed. Seeing this, Thomas turned to leave, intending to find Dr. Franz. But before he could go, Ellen crawled toward him and clung to him desperately. Her voice was cold and taunting, saying he will never be able to please her the way Orlok can. Thomas held Ellen tightly in his arms without a smelly kiss, refusing to let go until her madness subsided. But as he soothed his frantic wife, Orlok's shadow was already creeping toward Friedrich's family once more. That night, Ellen's friend was jolted awake by the screams of her two daughters. No matter how hard she shook her husband, he remained trapped in a death-like slumber. Left with no choice, she ran alone to the children's room, only to find them pale and lifeless, their tiny bodies drained of diabetic blood. When Friedrich finally woke, his entire family was gone. Thomas approached his grief-stricken friend and unbuttoned his shirt, revealing the wound on his chest. He admitted that everything Dr. Franz said is true. He was bitten by a demon as well. If not for the nuns' devout prayers, he would have succumbed to the plague. Meanwhile, Dr. Franz had spent the entire night poring over ancient texts. At last, he found the answer. To destroy Orlok completely, they must prevent him from returning to his coffin before dawn. Thomas remembered. Orlok had purchased the Glenwood estate. That meant his coffin must be hidden there. Thomas declared all they needed to do is destroy his resting place and drive an iron stake through his heart. That will rid Wisborg of this plague once and for all. Resolved, Thomas swore he would kill Count Orlok himself. But what he didn't realize was that Dr. Franz was deceiving him. Only the one who had bound the demon could break the curse. A simple iron stake was unlikely to harm a vampire. Dr. Franz's true plan was far more dangerous. Ellen would have to face Orlok herself. By afternoon, Thomas gathered the others, his confidence unwavering. But just as they were preparing for battle, they discovered that Friedrich was missing. There was still time before sunset, so Thomas decided to search for him. But when they arrived at the cemetery, they found Friedrich's lifeless body curled beside his wife and children. With heavy hearts, they burned the infected corpses. His friend's death pushed Thomas to the brink. He could no longer afford to wait until dawn. Driven by rage, he set out for Glenwood Estate under the cover of night. But charging into the lair of a vampire in the dead of night seems like just walking into his own doom. The group stormed into the estate, stepping over piles of rats that scurried beneath their feet. At last, they reached Orlok's coffin. With a trembling hand, Thomas raised the iron stake and plunged it down, only to find that the coffin held not Orlok, but the deranged real estate agent. A horrifying realization dawned upon Thomas. Obviously, Orlok has gone to find Ellen. Dr. Franz, knowing that this could ruin his entire plan, tried to stop Thomas from leaving. But Thomas was desperate to protect his wife. He shoved the doctor aside and ran. Left with no other option, Franz stayed behind and set fire to the entire estate. Tonight was the third and final night, the night of the fateful choice. Ellen sat before her mirror, carefully dressing herself in the finest garments. She had made up her mind. Her plan was simple. She would pretend to accept Orlok's proposal, using herself as bait to keep him by her side until sunrise. She would offer her own blood, allowing him to drink from her heart. Vampires could not resist the sweetness of fresh blood. Drunk on desire, Orlok lingered too long. By the time he realized the danger, the first golden rays of sunlight had already pierced through the darkness. The light burned through Orlok's decayed flesh, reducing him to nothing but a brittle skeleton. Ellen, drained of blood, could no longer hold on. With her final breath, she cradled Orlok's remains and fell into an eternal slumber. Thomas arrived too late. His beautiful wife was gone. And so, the story finally came to an end. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.